Every scientific discovery, whether it's a breakthrough in therapy or a new explanation for social behavior, begins with a simple question. But how does that question transform into an evidence-based, peer-reviewed conclusion? The answer lies in a structured sequence called the research process. In psychology, this process ensures that knowledge is built not on speculation, but on observation, testing, and replication. So in this lesson, we'll walk through the 7 essential steps of the research process, from defining a problem to writing and publishing the research report. The first step is identification of the problem. So every research journey begins with an identification of a problem, which is a question or an area of concern that needs to be addressed. Now, this first step involves recognizing a gap in existing knowledge or responding to a real-world issue that warrants more investigation. For example, a psychologist might observe that some children thrive in noisy classrooms while others struggle. This curiosity can lead to a research question such as, does background noise affect children's learning performance? The process of identifying a research problem involves 2 key sub-steps. So the first is understanding the problem thoroughly, which is by reflecting on personal observations, consulting your peers, or examining recurring issues in applied settings. The second is rephrasing the problem into meaningful, researchable terms so that it can be operationalized, studied, and measured in a scientific manner. An essential part of this phase is conducting a review of the existing literature, which helps in determining whether the problem has already been studied, and it helps in identifying if there are existing gaps in the knowledge, and it also suggests relevant variables and potential research designs that can be used. Resources such as peer-reviewed journals, scholarly books, abstracts, and databases like PsycInfo serve as valuable tools for this review. Ultimately, a good research problem is clearly defined, it's researchable within time and resource constraints, it's relevant to existing psychological theories or societal needs as well. Now, the next step that we would do is step 2 in this whole process is formulating a hypothesis. So once we have clearly understood the problem and we have identified and contextualized it using literature review from existing studies that have been done, the next step is to formulate a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a clear, testable, declarative statement that predicts a relationship between 2 or more variables. It serves as a tentative answer to the research question and forms the basis for designing the study. So, for example, if previous research and theory suggests that positive reinforcement enhances learning, so in the case of children, if you give them positive reinforcement like words that say, oh, wonderful, great, you're doing a good job, if you reinforce it in that way, it shows that learning is enhanced in the child. So a researcher who sees this in a classroom might observe or hypothesize that children who receive verbal praise will complete learning tasks faster than those who do not. So hypotheses are usually based on existing theories. They are inspired by earlier research findings that have been done in the field. They are derived from careful logical reasoning. And there are different kinds of hypotheses that we will see. The first is directional hypothesis, which predicts that the direction of the relationship. So it would either mean that when one variable increases, the other one also increases, or there's a corresponding decrease in one variable when the other increases, or that there is more of a certain aspect that occurs when something happens, or less of a certain aspect, or none. So non-directional hypothesis states a difference or relationship without specifying the direction. So we can say that there will be a significant change, but we don't really say whether it's going to be a positive change or a negative change, whether there's going to be more of the change or less of the change. Then there's null hypothesis. This assumes that there is no difference in a relationship. There is absolutely no difference. So regardless of whether one changes or the other changes, there's going to be no difference. It's just like saying that intelligence and shoe size, is there a relationship between the two? The answer is no. So far we've done research and it's been no. So there's absolutely no difference. There's no relationship there. But the alternative hypothesis to the null hypothesis would be to assume that there is a significant difference or a relationship between the two variables that we are studying. So it is important to formulate hypotheses before the data collection so that the research process remains unbiased and is scientifically credible. So even before we start data collection and figuring out how we're going to pull the information together, we need to have made this statement based on our previous knowledge of our previous observation and our study of existing literature from other published studies that we have looked through. Now, step 3 would be identifying, manipulating, and controlling the variables. In psychological research, a variable is any characteristic or condition that can change or be changed. So anything that will change on its own or can be changed by influence is called a variable. This step involves clearly identifying all the variables that will be examined in the study. There are 3 essential types of variables actually. The first is the independent variable, and this is the variable that the researcher manipulates to categorize, or actually they manipulate or they categorize it to examine its effect on another variable. So the independent variable is the main variable. Based on what you do on the independent variable, another variable is affected or another variable shows a change. So the main one that we are studying or influencing is the independent variable. Let's say in the study, the previous study that we talked about, where reinforcement or positive feedback to children causes them to show greater jumps in learning and capacity to learn. That's the study that we talked about before, right? So in that instance, reinforcement, that is the feedback that we give to the child, that is called the independent variable. Depending on whether we give positive feedback, the child's learning is affected, and if we give negative feedback, the child's learning is affected. So we are making changes to the independent variable and then studying its impact on another variable. Then we have the dependent variable. Now this is the variable that is measured to assess the effect of the independent variable, just like I said. So positive feedback or negative feedback. Feedback in itself is the independent variable, and depending on whether it's positive or negative, the number of tasks that a child will complete would vary. If you give them positive feedback, which is positive, you have a positive independent variable, then you would have more tasks completed, which is the dependent variable. If you have negative feedback given, which is again the negative independent variable, then the number of tasks completed would be less, which is the dependent variable in that case. The third one that we must be aware of is extraneous variables. Now these are all the other variables that might influence the dependent variable but are not the focus of the study. These must be controlled as much as possible to prevent confounding of the results. So if there's an element of, let's say, maybe if the activity is extremely enjoyable, then the children will complete more tasks, but if the activity is boring, then they'll complete less tasks. That could also be have an impact on how many tasks that the child completes, right? And in this case, we just want to see whether the influence of feedback is, how does it affect children and how does it affect their output. So if that's the case, then what we need to do is make sure that the task that's provided is the same every time we do the experiment. So if it's one particular, like arranging blocks in a certain order, then we must make sure that it's that same task or a similar task of that range should be given, so that that particular task or the enjoyability of the task does not impact the result of our experiment. So that's what it means by making sure that extraneous variables such as the enjoyability of the task and everything else that might influence the result should be kept under control. Now, to make variables measurable and consistent, researchers use operational definitions. An operational definition explains exactly how a concept will be measured or manipulated in the study. For example, stress might be operationally defined as a score of more than 25 on the perceived stress scale. So this clarity allows other researchers to understand exactly what was studied, and it helps in enhancing the replicability and scientific transparency of this particular research. The fourth aspect is formulating a research design.